This is Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.
Good morning out there in Radio Land. I'm glad you are up and you have turned your dial to 106.1. Excuse me, the Flip FM. I should have just waited a few more minutes and let that sneeze get out before I got on the radio, but as soon as I started going, it started building up. But isn't that life? Things just don't happen always according to your schedule. Well, I'm glad you've joined me today for Cogitations, for this short 30 minutes that we can spend together this Sunday morning. Last Sunday, we had taken a look at the Big Bang Theory, and I want to emphasize that word theory, and we had looked at a few things that just in the realm of science itself, scientific laws, scientific facts, that just dismantle the Big Bang Theory. It's not plausible when we consider the observable universe. And I said then, because we didn't have time then to get into it, we'd also take a brief look at evolution. To really dig into this topic deeply would take many radio sessions. I've taught this in schools before, and it would take a whole semester meeting 4 days a week for about an hour, so 4 hours a week over multiple months. So we have literally hours upon hours of things that could be dug into and looked at scientifically that ultimately say all of these theories are garbage. If you remember, I actually read from a science book at the beginning of last week's program, and even in that science book, talking about the origin of the universe, it basically said, all these theories you're going to read in this section, you could probably come up with something better. You got to consider the facts when looking at the theories, and the facts dispute the theory. So I said last time, Big Bang, that deals with the origin of the universe, the matter that's in the universe. Evolution, separate theory, it's good to address them separately, deals with the origin of life. So the physical universe comes into place, and then at some point, how did life inhabit this universe, particularly planet Earth? So they have this theory. Well, there's a lot of things we can look at in the evolutionary theory, and as soon as you start looking at it, you should start asking a lot of questions. I'm going to start today, and I can hold this up to the mic, but I'm pretty sure you can't see it. We don't have that technology yet to turn the sound waves into visual waves, but I'm holding a magazine. I like to collect a lot of things that are relative to science. I had the privilege of growing up. My earliest memories to the end of ninth grade was in the Smithsonian Institutes there in Washington, D.C., because my dad worked there. So I had an interest early on in all those kinds of things you see in the museums, things related to all different fields of science, as well as history itself. And so I have this Time magazine. It's from July 22nd of 2002. And it has a whole section in here looking at some of the missing links and asking the question if, have they found our first ancestor? And one of the things that I like to look at when it comes to their stuff and their timeline, and we talked last week about how their dating method isn't even plausible, because a lot of times they want to use C14 and C14 dating. You can't use it. You can't use it really past its first half-life with any accuracy. I had a biology teacher in Huntsville, Alabama, when I was going to take some classes there in science, and he had made a statement about talking about different things in evolution, and that this, whatever, he's talking millions of years this, millions of years that, hundreds of thousands of years this, and was basing it all on carbon dating. And so I raised my hand because I knew a guy that used to actually work in a carbon dating lab. And after about a year working in the carbon dating lab, he quit, saying this isn't science because their process was not scientific. Anything past that first half-life, the first half-life, which is roughly 5,700 years, is accurate. Anything past that became highly inaccurate. He said we would sample it 100 times. It would be anywhere from thousands of years to billions of years old. It would jump all over the place. But the policy was you take 100 readings, you average those 100 readings and stamp it as the official date. He said, this is not science. This is not science. This is just guesswork. So he quit and actually found Christianity because he began to question everything he was ever taught as a scientist. And he came to find out that the vast majority of it that he was told as fact was actually a lie. And so even in here, it has millions of years on its dating, which is impossible. And I'm sorry, I went away from my story. So I raised my hand and I said, hey, I know a guy used to work in a carbon dating lab. He said that after the first half-life, carbon dating becomes highly inaccurate. Is that true? So I just asked the biology teacher a simple question. He immediately, without hesitation, said, well, after the first half-life, it immediately becomes 400% inaccurate. That's when my other hand shot up, and he's like, yeah, what do you want? And I said, how can you be more than 100% wrong? It's 400% inaccurate, which means you're 4 times 100% wrong. And he's like, well, we got to move on. We don't got time for this discussion. That's because he doesn't have an answer, because he knows it's garbage. So in this Time magazine article looking at evolution, of course, it's taking the stance that they believe this is real and this is accurate. Of course, it is not. But what I like about it is it shows these skulls, okay? Lucy and her pals. And don't let me even get into Lucy. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you look at an actual real life rebuild of fragments, particularly on these skulls here, you will see that there's very little actual bone and that the vast majority is putty. You can see it in these color photos that you can't see, but one of them has purple putty. The other one has blue putty. And they're literally taking little pieces of bone fragment and imagining the rest. Just imagining the rest and how these might have fit together. And of course, our 1.9 to 1.6 million year old ancestor is exactly the same as a human skull. So it makes no sense. Any ones that are pretty much intact is exactly the same as a human today. And what I also liked in this Time magazine, it has a big 2-page open spread of our evolutionary timeline. And it goes all the way back to what they believe is the oldest ancestor in which we shared with chimpanzees and gorillas and other primates. And I know you can't see this. I'm going to try to describe it. But what's interesting is as you move forward from that original individual in which we were linked together with the monkeys, we go through all these evolutionary changes. They got all these different Homo-type creatures along there, evolving supposedly into modern man. But what's funny is on the primate side, it's a straight shot to modern day gorilla and chimpanzees. There is no evolution that they show. Well, if we were evolving, why weren't they evolving? Wouldn't everything be evolving? And if we are the current perfection of the evolutionary cycle, why would they not evolve in kind? Why are they even still here if we're the best thing to exist in the environment and to thrive? So there's a lot of questions that it brings into being. Now, I know their model is entirely impossible. We have known that for 125 years because in the year 1900, biologists and doctors working on human blood and understanding human blood came to understand that all human blood, I know there's 8 blood types, but all human blood across all ethnicities shares a common blood base. So what that means is that we have a common origin. Now, what it means in practicality is if I'm in the hospital and I'm dying and I'm in desperate need of blood to be transfused into my body, it doesn't matter as long as it's the right blood type. It doesn't matter if that blood comes from a Caucasian, comes from an Asian, comes from someone in Africa, comes from an Eskimo, comes from someone in Mexico. It doesn't matter the ethnicity of the individual because all human beings have the same blood base, which means they have a common point of origin. Well, if that's true, and evolution is true, that would mean that if I am dying in the hospital and need blood, they could just go to the local zoo and get some from a chimpanzee. But you can't, because no primate has the same blood base as human beings, which means we do not share a common origin based on the scientific understandings of blood. So that alone, you just got to throw out that whole concept of evolution and that we, like the other primates, come. In fact, when it comes to anatomy, and if you've ever gone to an anatomy class or if you've pursued being a doctor, a lot of times they're working on pigs. Why pigs? Because when it comes to the anatomy, pigs are closer to humans than anything else. And that's why they like to practice on them, to understand how different things are going to interact with the human body and the human anatomy. Not monkeys and gorillas and apes and all other primates. So they know scientifically that this is garbage. So let's think of a few other things. I mentioned Lucy, and we're going to look at a few others, but they have these supposed links. And remember, what you see in museums is just fantasy. Take Lucy, for instance. I mean, I could go to a museum, a scientific museum, and they will have a model of the Lucy skeleton, or they might even have an exhibit where they got skin and fur and everything else, and they show all these evolutionary stages of humanity. I've been to museums like that. I like the way one person put it, because all of these supposed links into human evolution, which as one gentleman I was actually listening to recently said, if you took all of the bones supposedly supporting human evolution, it would fill two garbage bags, and that's it. And if you really think about the existence of the earth and you measure population and stuff, as he pointed out, we should have billions of remains. Where are they? Where are the billions and billions of remains? Well, Noah's flood answers that, and how humans are smarter than the rest of the creatures, and they would have strived to try to survive the flood either by going to higher ground, and so eventually the water would reach them, trying to float some way, but eventually they would starve to death or dehydrate and die. So humans would have been the last thing to settle on the bottom of the water. And then as the waters receded, that recession of water would have dragged those remains into the ocean. Unlike other animals that would have died earlier and sediment would have settled on them on the mainland prior to the floodwaters receding. Remember, if you go back and read the biblical account, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but it was over a year before the waters receded. It tells you the age, the year, month, and day of Noah's life when he got on the ark, and the year, month, and day when he got off the ark. And so over a year, the earth is covered in water, and that sediment is burying what's there. The last thing, the barely top layer, would have been human remains. As the waters receded, it would have drug that top sediment into what ultimately formed where the water stopped as the oceans and seas. So the bulk of pre-flood human beings would be in the ocean and not on the mainland. But with evolution, we don't have this worldwide flood to account for the absence of remains. And so if their model's correct and you go back millions of years of existence of human ancestors, there should be billions and billions of skeletons to dig up. And they're not there. 2 trash bags. That's all they got. That's all they claim to have. And that's just mixed up fragments. So take Lucy, for instance. I like the way one guy put it. He'd like to know what locomotive hit her, because Lucy, if I remember correctly, is comprised of 17 bone fragments. Supposedly her whole skeleton is designed from 17 bone fragments that were scattered over 7 miles in Africa. Where did Lucy come from? Well, if you go back and actually look, the scientific team that was there to find the missing link, yes, you can't see my air quotes, missing link, well, they were being financed by a government grant. And their grant was getting ready to expire, and if they hadn't come up with anything, their grant wasn't going to be renewed. So they just took these random fragments that they had and tried to claim that they had this missing link that they labeled Lucy. Doesn't exist. Well, I'm gonna look at a couple of others here. Let's just take and I don't even remember where I got this nice sheet from. It's a copy of it. But you have this earliest man, this Heidelberg man, built from a jawbone that was considered by many to be quite human. So this entire ancestor of human being, according to evolution, all they have is a jawbone. And this jawbone looked kind of human, so they invented an entire skull and an entire body off of a jawbone. Like I said, it's more fantasy than reality. There's Nebraska man. You probably heard about him. Scientifically built up from one tooth. One tooth. Imagine pulling a tooth out of someone's head, traveling halfway across the world, giving that tooth to somebody else, and from that tooth alone, they recreate what that person looks like from head to toe. That doesn't happen. But later, some other scientists who were finally allowed access to evaluate this tooth found that this tooth actually belonged to an extinct pig, an extinct breed of pig. So Nebraska man is really built from the tooth of a pig. Peltdown man, the jawbone, once they allowed some independent scientists to take a look at it, the jawbone turned out to belong to a modern ape. So they built this whole evolutionary link from a jawbone, again, just a jawbone, that once independent scientists that didn't have a stake in the game and didn't have a preconceived evolutionary ideology were allowed access to examine it. They determined that what you have here is a jawbone of a modern-day ape. Peking man, supposedly from 5,000 years ago, but all evidence has disappeared. They had this supposed person, and once it began being evaluated by independent scientists, miraculously what they had disappeared. So that missing link is missing. Neanderthal man, as this initial Congress of Zoology, 1951, Dr. J.E. Cave said his examination showed that this famous skeleton found in France over 50 years ago is that of an old man who suffered from arthritis. So they have this skeleton remains that they had dug up in the last century, and an independent study of it. And of course, this is dated based on when it was written, but an independent study and examination of it by medical professionalists determined that what was here was actually just a human being, an old man who suffered from an extreme case of arthritis, which accounted for his slumped over appearance and various other factors which made them think this was some kind of missing link. New Guinea man dates way back to 1970, supposedly when they found them. This species has been found in the region just north of Australia. But again, New Guinea man is no different than the modern human male, and is very similar to the tribesmen that currently occupy Australia, those folks that live in the outback, the natives. And so no different than the modern folks living there. Cro-Magnon man, one of the earliest and best established fossils, is at least equal in physique and brain capacity to modern man. There's no difference. And so when they examine this one independently, again, the remains where they have more substantial remains is no different than a human being, a modern day human. And I like what they put here for the modern man. This genius thinks he came from a monkey. Romans 1:22, professing themselves to be wise, they become fools. We think we're wise, but we are not. And all through this supposed alleged fossil record, there's all kinds of holes. Evolution simply, that theory doesn't work. It goes against common sense. It goes against scientific facts, which refute it. And oddly enough, when these things are put before independent scientists that don't have any agenda other than truth, they fall apart because they're not based on truth. I like an example I read once. A guy was writing about his archaeological digs and stuff, and he was a paleontologist and worked on dinosaurs. Of course, he didn't believe in an old Earth. He believed in a young Earth. And right here in Texas, he was at a dig site, and there was fossilized imprints of dinosaur tracks. But oddly enough, right there with them was the imprint of human tracks, which would indicate that human beings and dinosaurs coexisted. Well, the biblical account would have them coexisting, but they coexisted. Well, he had an associate of his that was working at another nearby dig site who was an atheist and didn't believe in God, and he believed that humans and dinosaurs were separated by millions of years. And so he went and fetched his associate because he wanted to show him this. And so as they were coming, he explained to his associate what he had found. And when they get there, his associate refused to look at it, to look at these fossilized footprints that intertwined with one another, like the dinosaur and the human were walking on the same path or same trail roughly at the same time. And he would keep his back to it, and he refused to look at it. And in his memoirs, he had said he had asked his associate, well, why won't you look at this? Why won't you look at this? He goes, well, if I look at it, then I have to acknowledge that it exists and that you truly found it. If I don't look at it, I can continue to stand on the premise that I have never seen what you claim to have found. And unfortunately, that's how a lot of people navigate their lives. They refuse to look at the truth. Because as soon as I look at the truth, I got to, if I'm any kind of rational, I have to acknowledge the truth. A lot of them don't want to acknowledge the truth because the truth, if they acknowledged it and if they pursued it, even scientifically pursued the truth. And I mentioned about the class that I do on occasion. Of course, it takes months to get through everything, but I start with that premise. And the ideal is, if I'm having a conversation with an atheist, well, an atheist doesn't believe in the Bible, might as well be opening Shakespeare. So I got to be able to make an intellectual argument for the existence of a divine mind, a divine creator, without using the Bible. And oddly enough, if you take a true, honest look at what science has established as truth, I'm not talking theories. Theories are, I guess this is how it works. I guess this is what it is. But you look at the hard facts, the scientific laws, they lead you to the only reasonable probability is, in the beginning, God created. Some divine mind, some eternal essence created. That's where true science leads in a true evaluation. I think of it in terms of forensics and forensics science. You've probably watched a lot of TV shows with all these forensic investigators and stuff. There's just a ton of them out there. But in true forensics, I'm not actually trying to prove how something happened. I want to disprove. So you show up on a crime scene, there's a person murdered in the floor, there's a pool of blood, you begin to examine them. Okay, what kind of wounds are on the body? Okay, there's these kinds of wounds. Okay, so you make a list. What's all the possible things that could make a puncture wound? And then you begin to eliminate those things till you're left with one thing that you can't disprove. Same thing. Well, how did the assailant enter the house? All the doors are locked. The windows are shut. None of the windows are broken. All the windows are locked. And you begin to say, well, what's all the ways you could enter the house? Doors, windows, crawl through an air vent, come up through a subfloor, enter through the vent to the attic and come in through that. And you just list all the ways. And then you begin to eliminate. Well, none of the windows are broken. All the windows are nailed shut. I lived in a house once. I was renting, and it was so annoying. I couldn't open the windows for fresh air because someone before me nailed them all shut. And so they didn't come in through the windows, and you can go and begin to eliminate until you only have one possibility left that you cannot disprove. And no matter how improbable it might seem to you, it's the answer. Well, if we went through that full method that takes months, all I'm left with is God. Some divine mind, divine being who's all-knowing, who has a brilliance beyond our comprehension when you look at the mathematical equations that govern our universe and even govern the existence of life. I mean, we're just barely scratching the surface of understanding DNA and understanding the functionality of our own bodies. And then you look across the entire scope of biology and how interdependent all kinds of different species and plant life is with one another, that they had to have all come into existence at once to sustain the balance and harmony, and for most of them to continue to exist in their reliance on all these others and these other factors. And so you look at all of that and you're left with God. And of course, since God is not matter or energy, but is this thing called spirit, and we don't understand what that is comprised of, well, the laws of physics that govern matter and energy would not govern spirit, because it is not matter, nor is it energy. Well, our time is about expired for today, and I don't know what we'll move on to next Sunday on Cogitations, but I hope you join us and we can examine those. And hey, just stay curious. Question the things that people put in front of you as answers to our origin and answers to the existence of the universe. And if you really dig into the science, you'll find that these theories are bogus and they don't stand up to the examination. May God bless you. May God keep you. And I look forward to joining you again on Cogitations next Sunday morning at 9 a.m.
Tune in next Sunday at 9 for another edition of Cogitations with Carl Hartman, minister at Main Street Church of Christ in Lockney.